we're out here trying to tell stories of courage and hope. We've really always been looking for where are the instances where things are coming together in a way that these spiritual longings are being met, right? So we really want to understand more about where and why that is happening, and we want to catalyze more of it, right?
I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, the podcast that seeks to expand our understanding of beauty, what it is, how it works, and why it matters for the work we do. This season of the podcast is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust and is focused on the beauty and burdens of innovation. What does spiritual innovation look like on the ground, in real communities, and what does it take to make it both responsible and beautiful? Addressing these questions are my guests today, Casper Ter Kuile and Angie Thurston. Casper and Angie are co-founders of Sacred Design Lab. Casper is the author of The Power of Ritual, co-creator of the podcast Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, and co-founder of Nearness. He holds master's degrees in public policy and divinity from Harvard, where he served as a ministry innovation fellow, and he speaks widely on the future of ritual, community, and beauty. Angie is co-founder and executive director of Sacred Design Lab and has worked with hundreds of innovative leaders addressing spiritual longings in a time of religious change. She's co-written 8 public reports, including the widely influential How We Gather, and partnered with organizations from On Being and Esalen to Pinterest and IDEO, as well as major religious denominations. She now serves as an executive fellow at Harvard Business School, helping develop the new course, The Spiritual Lives of Leaders. In our conversation, we will trace the founding of Sacred Design Lab and the unmet needs that they're tracking: belonging, meaning, formation, and the spiritual infrastructure that innovators require. We dive into their new Spiritual Innovation Report, looking at their goals and methodology and findings from interviews across 37 countries, and discuss the emerging Spiritual Innovation Hub they're developing. Along the way, we talk about the opportunities and burdens of spiritual innovation and what they're seeing among Gen Z. Let's get started. All right, Casper and Angie, it's a pleasure to have you both on the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, to get started, I had sent you guys a question, which I normally ask my podcast guests to begin with, which is, could you share a memory of beauty from your childhoods that linger till today? I wonder what cropped up in your minds as I asked this question. Perhaps, Angie, we could start with you.
I would love to. And it's such a nice question. Thank you, Brandon. So I grew up in San Francisco, and I was 4 years old during the earthquake of 1989, which, of course, in and of itself, I would not necessarily describe with that word beauty, but there is a specific memory that I have from that day. And for context, my nuclear family was fairly isolated. I didn't grow up with much family around, and we didn't have much community either. But that night, all the power went out in San Francisco, and we were lucky enough that our house was mostly okay. And because of that, there were a few people in my parents' life who came over that evening. And I remember falling asleep, and in the next room, my parents were there with some friends by candlelight, and they were laughing and talking and sort of whispering. And I just had this feeling that I hadn't had much in my life to date as a kid of, I guess I would say it was a feeling of belonging. It was a feeling of just that sort of subtle web of life and connection that I was part of and they were part of. And I think part of the beauty of it to me was this feeling that I didn't have to do anything. I was just there in my bed as a 4-year-old, and I could just fall asleep, and this set of relationships, this love was happening anyway. And There was just sort of a givenness to it. And I still remember that sense inside of myself from that particular experience, and the feeling that it has is one of beauty.
Wow, what is extraordinary. Thank you. Yeah. Casper, what came to your mind?
Well, Brandon, I have to thank you. Angie and I have worked together for 12 years, and it's rare that I hear a story that I haven't heard before, but that's lovely, Ange. Thanks for sharing that. Brandon, I grew up in the UK, and I went to a Waldorf school as a child, so I don't know how much our listeners will be familiar with kind of Steiner education, but it's a very ritual-heavy, kind of nature-based, fascinating theological project of kind of combining Christianity with Hindu reincarnation, very interesting kind of things to explore there. But one of the gifts of growing up in a Waldorf school was that they encouraged parents, and so my mother did this in our home, to have a nature table. And what that looked like was in the hallway, the kind of entryway of our home. And I grew up with 3 sisters, and we had lodgers living upstairs. So it was a big house filled with people. But in the entryway, there was this little table, and each kind of season, really every few weeks, it changed. There were postcards of if it was in the summer season, there would be like beaches, and in the autumn there would be beautiful leaves that were changing color, and in Advent season there would be 24 stars that little mini Joseph and Mary would walk over, kind of 1 star every day towards the manger of Bethlehem, and so it was just this sense of living in time, and I think that's for me where the beauty really was. It was that the visual, of flowers or rocks or crystals or something, but it also it was a constant reminder that where we were in the kind of natural life cycle of the earth and its seasons. And so that's something I recently moved house and was kind of, having conversation with my husband about what makes a house a home. And I was like, we must have a nature table. That's non-negotiable.
Oh, wow. Well, that's great. That's really quite a testament to your school there and to the Waldorf method. And these themes of both belonging and of ritual, perhaps, are so central to the work y'all are doing at Sacred Design Lab. How did you two meet, and how did you come to start this initiative, Sacred Design Lab?
So Casper and I met in 2013 in our very first week, perhaps one of our first days at Harvard Divinity School. We had both come in, Casper had come in to get a public policy degree at the Kennedy School. So he had been there at the university for a little while, but I was newly arrived, and we were both in the same required seminar, an introduction to ministry studies. And it was in that seminar that we had the requirement to share our spiritual autobiographies. Just each of us sharing kind of our origin story and how our lives intersected with religion and spirituality. And the way I remember it is that when Casper shared his spiritual autobiography, I basically pounced on him after class and was like, you see what I see. We need to work together. And basically what that was that both of us had come of age outside of religion in the sort of formal institutional sense. And both of us had a real sense that there were a lot of needs, which I think we would both now describe as spiritual needs, spiritual longings, that were occurring for people who did not have a sense of religious identity or religious community, and that we wanted to, in some ways, serve people who were feeling that way. And so we became friends, but pretty quickly. I think even when we would have dinner together, we would have an agenda. So it became quickly quite clear that we had work to do together.
Wow.
I don't know what you would add or change, Casper, about that narrative.
No, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I would only say that, Angie and I, as we became friends, just started to learn together. We started to interview people who were doing kind of spiritual or religious things in secular places. So our interest was really trying to understand this kind of landscape, especially of our generation of millennials at that point, who were outside of religion but still doing religious things. And so we ended up writing this kind of, I hesitate to say this to an academic like yourself, but a sort of public paper that was really aimed at a general readership to try and illustrate not what the dominant narrative was at the time, which really was a decline of religion, but from our perspective, really a transformation of religion, so that people were still being spiritual, doing spiritual things, but in places like CrossFit or maker spaces or the workplace or artistic communities. And so we've always had this kind of dual role, which I've loved about working with Angie, of both being kind of students of what's happening and having a leg into the academy and into research, but also really as practitioners, as people who are really invested in this personally and creating projects, creating interventions, creating media that speak to that landscape at the same time. And we keep finding ways to work together.
It's astounding. Casper, you'd also started a very influential podcast on Harry Potter. Could you say a word about how that fit into all of this?
Well, this is a great example of kind of one of those practitioner projects. Another classmate of ours, Vanessa Zoltan, in divinity school, and I became friends. And she was doing this fascinating kind of writing about reading a sacred text. She grew up as an atheist Jew. That would be the language she used, and where belief in God was not part of the picture, but the practices of religious life certainly were, and sacred reading was a big part of that. But she didn't want to read the Torah, and so she was reading Jane Eyre as a sacred text with one of our beloved professors, Stephanie Purcell. And I found this quite intriguing. I was like, what is sacred reading? I didn't know anything about Lectio Divina or, the kind of Ignatian imagination practices or Havruta or Pardes, the Jewish practices. And so I went along to this little group that she was hosting on a Wednesday night with, 3 or 4 women who were reading a chapter of Jane Eyre, taking a sentence and doing Lectio Divina with it, and having these amazing conversations about mental health and heartbreak and love and courage. And I said to Vanessa, this is really awesome. We should do it with a book people actually read. And so, which is, I mean, no disrespect to the Brontes, but what that led to was it kind of paired with my own exploration of, not growing up Christian. And so having to take an introduction to Hebrew Bible in Church and New Testament class and finding it interesting, but at the same time not feeling like it was my text to interrogate, or I didn't have a relationship with it. That's changed now. But at that point, I was really looking for what are the epic stories? What are the myths, the legends that I feel like I have a right to engage with, to interpret? And so I was interested in Lord of the Rings. I was interested in Game of Thrones. I was interested in Harry Potter. And so those two kind of influences came together, and we were extremely lucky. Always go to the conference that you're invited to, because I met this random guy at a conference who happened to be the man in charge of the homepage of iTunes at that point. And so when we launched the podcast, having run it as an in-person class for a year, when we launched the podcast, I sent it to this guy and he was like, oh, this is cool. I'm going to put you on the homepage. And that ended up attracting just an enormous audience. And what happened was that we really became sort of chaplains to a fandom. And so that podcast has been running nearly for 10 years now, and it will close next year in 2026, having read through all the books twice, chapter by chapter. And it led to hundreds of local reading groups that would do Lectio Divina with the Harry Potter books. We run secular pilgrimages now. There's a thriving digital community. So it's been amazing to see how people who would never go looking for spiritual practices, but they were looking for the comfort and the connection of the story that they loved. And we always say we don't read it as entertainment. We read it as in not instruction per se, but as an opportunity to mirror back into our own lives the big questions about values, about how to live a good life, and the text and these practices particularly really help you kind of use the text as a mirror to ask yourself big questions.
Yeah, amazing. So how did this idea for the Sacred Design Lab then come about in the midst of all this? And what was it that that spurred you to actually create this thing? And then what are you trying to do presently with it?
Well, Casper alluded to this report we wrote, this public paper, How We Gather, back in 2015. And it is worth re-emphasizing, we were just grad students at the time, right? We had some shared priorities about the kind of work we wanted to do, I would say both of us were really looking at these innovative communities that seemed to be meeting needs that perhaps in many cases religion, both historically and currently, would meet, but that people, the kind of people in our orbit, especially at the time we were looking at millennials who tended to be religiously unaffiliated or uncomfortably affiliated, we were asking, where are they going to find meaning and belonging and purpose? And so that led to this little report, How We Gather, but it also led us to get to know a whole host of these innovative community leaders around the United States. And what kept happening, and I had trained before that as a playwright, and it was, these folks who were running fitness communities and arts communities and justice movements, they seemed to be dissimilar. And yet it was as if they had a shared script about the kinds of work that they were doing and the ways that it was touching people and meeting them. And what we found is that these leaders in many respects were acting in a sort of pastoral role for the people in their communities, even though their communities were nominally secular. And so we began to learn about their needs. And one of the primary needs that we noticed amongst them was that they felt awfully lonely in their leadership and that they also felt under-resourced in the dimensions of their leadership that were addressing these deeper needs amongst the people in their care. And so we started gathering these leaders. And at first we were gathering secular leaders. Then we started gathering leaders whose communities actually did have a religious affiliation, or where the leader themselves might, but where the community was not. It kind of looked more like these innovative secular communities than it did your traditional congregational model, for instance. So this was things like people meeting in laundromats and washing clothes for those who might be experiencing homelessness as a kind of expression of modern day foot washing, right? Or Muslim small groups meeting in living rooms, at the time online Buddhist sanghas before COVID and everyone
For
going
COVID,
online.
yeah.
So that became a sort of network that Casper and I were cultivating amongst these leaders. We've come to call these folks spiritual innovators. At the time, we didn't have that language yet. And so that's one big strand that I would say has run through our work and still does to this day. That was some of the impetus behind founding Sacred Design Lab. But the other was that as we continued getting to know these innovative leaders and working with them, we also received an unexpected response from a lot of institutions. And at first, this was religious institutions and, everything from denominations to large scale congregations and foundations, people basically asking, what is going on with rising generations? And in many cases, they were experiencing institutional decline. And so they wanted to talk to us and understand what was going on. And then sometimes secular organizations would sort of be encountering the same challenges, the cultural challenges of, oh, we have this huge rise in loneliness, right? And a sense of isolation. We have a rise in mental health and it challenges and people experiencing, this kind of ennui and in some cases devastation. What's going on with that? And how do we respond in a secular landscape? And we were sort of saying, well, actually, there's a lot of wisdom in religion about this, right? So we became a kind of, we found ourselves in a bridge position. And so when we graduated from divinity school in 2016, we said, okay, well, I think Casper and I sort of looked at each other like, are we going to do this for real? Are we going to try to do this as our job? And it's been a long and meandering road since then of how we've made it work. But ultimately, we did found Sacred Design Lab with our colleague Sue about 7 years ago now to really try to bring together this body of work and see what we could meaningfully contribute.
Yeah, wow. Could you say a little bit about, and you talked about sort of these fundamental unmet needs that you're trying to address. Say a bit more about the design and the lab aspects of what you're trying to do.
Well, there's a few parts of that. One is that we Angie and I just like to do a lot of interesting things, and using a word like lab allows you to do that. But in all seriousness, it allowed us to partner with very different types of groups for projects that all touched on these same questions, but in very different contexts. So, for example, we worked with the Episcopal Bishop in Chicago to host a liturgy lab. So this was a small convening in which we brought together secular experience designers who worked as museum curators or, hosted festivals, like music festivals, together with Episcopal liturgists who were steeped both in the scholarship of liturgy, but also in the practice of it in Episcopal congregations. And that led to some fascinating insights of applying this idea of spiritual innovation, of how do we meet those enduring needs in ways that really resonate with audiences that won't necessarily walk into an Episcopal church. And one insight that I'll never forget is Ida Benedetto, who is an amazing experience designer who lives here in Brooklyn, not too far away from me, had done some research looking at, of all things, wilderness retreats, funerals, and sex parties. And her insight was that for transformation to occur, you needed an element of risk. And when she shared that in this group of Episcopal liturgists, I remember Patrick, Mahoney, I think is his last name, the former dean at St. John the Divine, saying, my goodness, as a liturgist, I'm nearly always designing for safety. What would it be like to design for risk in liturgy? So those kind of conversations, don't happen by themselves. And so that was one element of the lab. But we've also created, in partnership with the Wellbeing Trust, a foundation that came out of the healthcare sector that was really interested in understanding, okay, we understand social health, we understand mental health. What is spiritual health? Can you help us think through what does that look like? And so we both did a bunch of research and then created our own kind of personal inventory and sort of a mini self-analysis tool that you could use to just get in touch with what is my spiritual health? How do I think about the different elements, the contours of what might make up my spiritual well-being? So the lab allows those kind of, unlikely partnerships, but with a continued question of how do we nurture spiritual life today and tomorrow?
Amazing. Great. One of the more recent research products you've put out is this amazing report on illuminating spiritual innovation. Could you say a little bit about what you mean by spiritual innovation? What led you to, I suppose, to focus on that word? And what do you mean by spiritual innovation? And say a little bit about the work you did, the actual, the research, where you went, who you talked to, and what you were trying to learn in doing that work.
Well, I would say that the origin of us using that phrase really dates back to this time that we've just been describing, where I think Casper and I both came to this body of work from a real, with real practitioner hearts, and I would say with in a very capacious use of the word ministry, a desire to minister,
Right.
to serve in a context that was rapidly changing. And so this idea of spiritual innovation, I think for us has always had something to do with how do you meet the soul needs, the spiritual longings of those who, in general, but I think especially in a context where a number of the traditional structures and institutions and even in some cases theologies and rituals are not fit for purpose amongst a growing population. So what do you do about that? It really has felt to us in some ways like a design question. I think going back to your question about why we called it Sacred Design Lab, there's a whole host of really rich and challenging design questions at stake right now. And so I think for us, we were really wanting to build on the scholarship and practitioner wisdom about this concept of innovation and apply it to the question of spiritual needs and spiritual longings. So when we use it, that's what we mean by it, is we're looking at new ways to address spiritual longings. And let me say that, of course, that word innovation can be quite fraught in certain contexts and can have a lot of overtones depending on where you are socially located, geographically, religiously. And so that has been a big part of our work in trying to find language that is effective enough, that's meaningful enough to get at this work, and yet also sort of capacious enough to hold it. And I think it's imperfect. And so as a result, we will often also accompany the phrase spiritual innovation with other words. Spiritual imagination, spiritual transformation, spiritual evolution, spiritual adaptation we were just talking about. So it's imperfect language, but I think the fact that it is connected to some bodies of work around how you design for meaningful change is helpful, because that is a big part of what we want to support.
And so kind of practically what the research involved was a huge amount of interviews with spiritual innovators and scholars around the world. And we were lucky enough to visit a number of countries. We were in Japan, Brazil, Angie was in India, I was in Egypt, we were in Kenya, the UAE, and of course here in the US as well. But our work had really been very US focused before. So it was a real excitement for us to be able to kind of expand our scholarly gaze and look beyond into very different contexts. And in some ways, I would say we were surprised by how much alignment there was with the US context. Like it certainly there were very, very different national situations or religious contexts. Islam in particular, being in Egypt was really interesting to kind of understand that more, and the UAE. But we worked with a team of postgrads, mostly researchers in kind of 7 different regions. So we had just more than 100 interviews with practitioners and scholars. And it was fascinating. One of my most memorable interviews was in Egypt. I was in Cairo meeting with Amr Khaled, who was, if you're on the streets of Egypt and you ask anyone, who is he, everybody knows. He was kind of the face of he was the first kind of televangelist, you might say, in the 90s. And he's just had a multi-decade kind of public presence and has always used technology very innovatively. So he was, the first to be out, sold in, tapes and cassettes and then DVDs on street corners. Now is in this really interesting place where his kind of theology, his kind of theological project is to combine traditional Islamic theology with positive psychology. So he's integrating kind of a more recent, scientific research base, aligning it with traditional Islamic theology to create a sort of formation path. And that's my language, not his, but he talks a lot about ihsan, the idea of kind of perfection, of growing towards perfection, and teaches that through a series of digital programming and fellowships and leadership cohorts with young Muslims around Europe and North Africa, having him reflect on his own experience of being influenced by his travels in India, of this, kind of secular scholarship, and yet embedding it in kind of a Muslim worldview was just a fascinating example of someone innovating within a tradition. And I should say that this idea of spiritual innovation really does sit both outside of traditions, inside, and at the edge of it. And so whenever we were doing these kind of research, whether it was a Buddhist monk in Japan who teaches surfing lessons and then builds in some meditation to kind of sneak that in, whether it's people creatively building it into a tradition, or, something like Homecoming, a digital platform that helps people integrate psychedelic experiences, that's based in Canada. That's totally outside of religious context, but still very, very much engaging a lot of spiritual practices, even if it's in a sort of medical frame.
Right. Angie, is there a story from one of your cases that surprised you or maybe challenged your assumptions or that you found especially striking?
Yeah, well, Casper was just speaking about Japan, and I think that was one of the most moving for me was when we were outside of Tokyo. We were in a Buddhist temple, and part of the learning for me around the way that a lot of the Buddhist lineages in Japan are passed down is that it's often within families. You'll have multiple generations. And so there's still a decision point for someone who is engaged in that kind of leadership, but there is also a sense of inheritance and responsibility, right? And so this particular spiritual innovator, this monk, Reverend Fujio, was speaking to us about how he has tried to respond to the crisis of isolation in Japan, which is part of why we chose to go to Japan, is because that is so acute there, and there's also a lot of deaths of despair in Japan right now, and especially among young people. And so Reverend Fujio had a lot of direct impacts of this in his own life. He had lost a few friends to suicide, and he just saw the way that, if you here in the United States where we're based, there some people will look at religious spaces, in some cases Christian spaces, because that's our dominant religion in the United States, and say, well, I go there just for holidays, right? For Christmas and Easter, or for funerals, and that's the relationship that a lot of people in Japan have to Buddhist temples, is it's more for ceremonial purposes and can feel to some people out of touch with everyday life. And Reverend Fujio just said, I think that it's my work to actually go straight into the social problems that I see with the tradition that I have inherited. And so he has dedicated himself to ministering to those who are feeling so depleted that they're in a mental health crisis. And so he basically lives his life as a vigil and makes himself available for people to come. And he will, if they come, he will just sit with them. And basically the metaphor he used was, I help them recharge their battery. So he'll start with the physical level and just say, are you hot? Are you cold? Do you need water? And then he'll walk zazen with them for as long as they need in order to feel that they can actually access their body again before he'll even go to any matters of the mind or of the heart or the spirit. And he has taken this into the metaverse. So he leads Zazen in the metaverse and started doing this during COVID. So they have like a whole sort of virtual version of the temple that anyone can join. And he also has started a collective of other spiritual practitioners, mostly Buddhist monks and chaplains, who are dedicated to working together around this issue of how they prevent suicide. So there's this kind of intersection of working with technology, working with social problems, and also deeply drawing out the gifts of his tradition, in terms of especially that sort of commitment to practice and the wisdom of what it is like to actually put your body in different positions in order to help access different states. So anyway, I was just very touched by his devotion and the ways that he's applying creative energy to this particular predicament.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well, a lot of the examples you've cited seem to certainly resonate with problems that we're familiar with in the West here, right? Like loneliness and then the kind of general kind of secularization, the alienation from ourselves, from our, received traditions. Did you find any problems or crises that are rather different, perhaps, from what we experience in the West?
Yeah, I think the role of the state was really interesting. Certainly, when we were in Brazil, for example, meeting with practitioners of Umbanda and a host of different kind of African traditions that have mutated and changed in the Brazilian context. Many were very actively repressed for a long time. And it was interesting. We were in Rio in February. And so we happened to be there on the celebration day of Iamanja, who is kind of the ocean water divinity or deity. People wear white, go to the beach, offer kind of gifts of thanks. So people bring food, flowers. Couple of bottles of champagne were spotted, which other, as ever in these kind of ritual spaces, you have some people engaging in a beautiful practice of devotion. Others are there just to pick up the free food and champagne that is left on the beach. But rather than the state, having played this very repressive role, now this was municipally celebrated and funded because it's now seen as a draw for tourism. So just the changing way in which kind of state interaction with traditions, especially in post-colonial contexts. Brazil was a particular example where it had been embraced. That's certainly not always the case. But that was something that did feel noticeably different from the US. I don't know, Angie, if there's others that come to mind for you.
Yeah, I would say that that theme writ large, and this is part of the discomfort with the language of innovation in especially, I think we experience that in the Middle East and in Muslim contexts because of the association of innovation with Bida and with this idea of new invention inside of Islam, which is essentially seen as heresy in many cases. That was one important difference of context in terms of, I'd say broadly in the United States, there is a culture of lionizing innovation and entrepreneurship, right? A sense of that is a path to getting ahead, is to creating something new. And that, while that's not always true in religious spaces in the United States, I think it is the kind of the cultural water that we swim in. So that was definitely not the case, I'd say, in Muslim majority context. And then also, I'd say, especially in Africa and Latin America, with the specifics of colonialism. And I think also American hegemony was a big factor. I mean, we really experienced the pushback against that language, specifically with the connotation of, oh, we're going to take something and essentially exploit it and use it for profit. Like that was the specific association with innovation in an American context and also in a colonial context, right? We're just going to sort of pilfer what's here and use it for our own gain as the sort of colonizer culture. And so that the strong pushback, I'd say, the sort of counter perspective that we often were met with in these conversations was one in which, well, everything is naturally evolving. If you look at the natural world, that there's a quality of transformation that is just part of our existence, and we are part of that. And so the idea that humans would come in and be the inventors, be the innovators, be the ones to come up with something new is actually just an inaccurate understanding of the world, and kind of based on a colonial logic that is counter to and has done violence to a lot of cultures around the world. So I'd say there was pretty strong resistance in a lot of cases, even while I think there were also a number of experiences of this shared conundrum of people really trying to figure out how to live in today's world in a way that is meaningful and rich and grounded in something beyond themselves, and contending with that struggle. So I think, as Casper said earlier, there were some through lines there. We had a really beautiful dinner with a group of young people it was in Dubai, right, Casper, where, we were sort of finding some of our peers in that context who were sharing on a personal level, how they're holding the religion that they grew up with alongside the realities of their life today, right? So that was there in a sort of personal individual expression. but at the cultural level, we're dealing with really different contexts.
All right, everybody, that's a good place to pause the first half of our conversation. In the second half, we're going to turn from the stories to the bigger patterns that Casper and Angie are seeing in their work. What makes spiritual innovations succeed or struggle? How leaders sustain integrity amid burnout and financial pressure, and why mentorship and community are essential for this emerging field. See you next time.